Hi, I'm Sheila Kuehl. Welcome to Get Used to It. Today we are filming our show in a new location because that's what this show is about. This is the One Institute and Archives, the International Gay and Lesbian Heritage and Research Center that just opened in Los Angeles. Today I have three wonderful guests to talk about why do we do this? Why do we collect our past and think about it and share it with each other and visit it? What's the importance there? That's our topic. Our guests, when I asked them to tell me what epithets they'd like attached to their names, indicated collectively we have three activists, two authors, an artist, a therapist, and a publisher. However, we only have three guests, and they're quite distinguished. We have Mark Thompson. Mark, welcome. Mark is author, activist, therapist. Very happy that you're here.
Thank you.
Patricia Nell Warren, author, publisher, activist.
Great to be here.
Thank you, Patricia. Thanks for being with us. And Michael Kearns, who lists himself as artist and activist, a fine actor and performer. Welcome, Michael.
Good to be back.
Nice to have you back. Mark, I want to start with you, if I may.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about your background, most especially what might have led you to be interested in sort of bringing together our history.
Well, it's been a journey that started for me when I came out at San Francisco State University in 1973 and was one of the founders of the Gay Students Coalition there, one of the very first gay activist groups in California, and in the journalism department. And that's when it all began for me in terms of the activist part.
Coming out.
And organizing and making community. And I was graduating in 1975, and one day I got a letter from David B. Goodstein offering me a job. And my journalism professors at the time said, "Don't do it, you'll ruin your career, you have a great career coming, whatever you do, don't go into gay journalism."
Oh, offered you a job in gay journalism?
Yeah, and I said, well, I'd rather do this than to go work for the San Francisco Chronicle, which I didn't think was a very good paper at that time. So I took the offer, and I worked for the magazine as a journalist, a reporter, and eventually as the senior editor for the next 19 years.
Right, I knew that.
Yeah.
So clearly as a writer, I mean, one of the purposes, it seems to me, of doing a magazine is not just sort of the ephemeral nature of each article.
Right.
It's not just there like telling, even oral tradition actually was meant to last, but really an idea of capturing something. What was it the Advocate thought it was capturing in those days?
Well, I think the zeitgeist of the time, which was a movement being born or reborn. One of the things I've learned through my involvement with this project is, of course, that the organized roots of our gay and lesbian movement go back to the late 40s and early 1950s. But I was what I would call of the boomer generation. I was a member of the first post-Stonewall generation of gay kids to come out on campus. So that was a different kind of activism. There was like a wall there between the prior homophile movement and then the gay rights movement, which was much more of a civil rights movement. Take it to the streets kind of movement, and we did. So aside from all of my work with the magazine, I was here going through the files, and I realized I had written or the cover story or edited or in some way contributed to over 450 issues of the magazine. I'm also the author of 5 books on gay history and culture, and this has been my life, to document and to illuminate and to reveal what I think the true nature of our experience is.
Now, did you have any sense of the history of our movement when you first came out?
No, I really didn't. I grew up in Carmel, California, and you know, I didn't realize, apparently I was growing up in the sweater queen capital of the world. In other words, the town was filled with lovely gay men. But I was a local boy. I grew up in the same town where my dad was born, and his father too. So it was kind of a hands-off, and of course, like many people that are coming out at that age, I was keeping it very internal and stuffed down inside. But one day I remember that my father, who was a contractor in the area, was fixing some pipes in a beloved old theater up in Carmel Valley called the Tanamont Theater. It was run by two of the most wonderful gay men, Francois and Ralph, and they met in Boston in 1933 and had a beautiful puppet theater there on Beacon Hill with marionettes, and they toured the country. They were very famous in their time. They also designed the Macy's Christmas windows during the Depression era. So anyway, they retired and took this old barn and made a marvelous theater, and they would bring out the marionettes, and I remember as a little boy seeing them perform. But on weekends they'd show wonderful old movies like Camille and, you know, musicals and things, and there wasn't much else to do in Carmel Valley, so everyone would come. So my father and everyone knew that they were a gay couple, and they were completely beloved and accepted. So my father took me out to the garage when I was about 17, and we had one of those father-son conversations. I said, "Are you?" And I said, "Oh, I don't think so." But he knew better, and he said, "I have a job for you. Ralph and Francois need a ticket taker and an assistant."
How lovely of your dad.
Yeah, and he knew.
Yeah.
So he gave me the keys to the family car, and that began my education. And they took me in and told me all of their stories and gave me self-esteem.
So it was a very personal history in a way.
Yes.
I mean, I think when we talk about the history of the movement, there are so many strands and streams. I mean, I think most of us start with, I'm the only one in the world, and then there's my own kind of history. And then when we meet people, especially people of a previous generation to ours, we get a sense that this goes back, you know, farther and farther and farther. Hearing the stories, as I have, of women in the, you know, in the wax, and or the women who worked with General Eisenhower. You know, the stories that we've all heard. And then to begin to realize that there's a larger story here of a community, which of course is woven of all the stories of everyone. But the Institute kind of has its own story as well. I mean, this is a wonderful edifice, and with, I can see an enormous, I mean, it seems very large, a very large collection. Must be one of the largest in our country.
It is quite literally, and this is not just hype or anything. This is without question the world's largest repository of historical material documenting the experience of gay and lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered people on the planet. The One Institute and Archives is the preeminent institution of memory on planet Earth in terms of gay and lesbian experience.
Now, how did the strands come together to form this institute?
Well, again, we're talking about 1,001 stories, and going from the personal to the collective, as you might say, and that's how this collection started in 1942. A very dear man by the name of Jim Kepner started acquiring the first books in his San Francisco apartment, and the collection just grew and grew and grew and grew over the years. Meanwhile, here in Los Angeles, the foundations of the gay rights movement in America were being seeded by the Mattachine Society, which formed here in a small house overlooking Silver Lake Reservoir in January of 1950. Now, out of that came another group that was incorporated in 1952 called One Incorporated. And one of their great achievements was publishing One magazine, which was the first magazine for gay and lesbian people. Only it couldn't be mailed through the U.S. Postal Service because that was illegal. So the group took their case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court and won a landmark legal victory in 1958. So that opened the floodgates for freedom of expression and freedom of press for gay and lesbian people. So as the 60s and the sexual revolution and my generation kind of came on the stage, the group kind of, you know, faded a little bit into the pages of history, but, you know, was still intact. So what happened in 1994, as the founders of both groups, Jim Kepner with the collection, the International Gay and Lesbian Archives, and Dora Legg, who was one of the founders with Don Slater and others of one, were ailing. It was suggested that the two groups be put together. And so that's the One Institute and Archives, is the two groups merged. And then over the years, we've had other collections, like the Homosexual Information Center collection. And we have a lovely collection here called the Lesbian Legacy Collection, which is a whole dedicated space for women's material. We have the AIDS History Project here, and a whole other wing of the building that is filled with thousands, tens of thousands of documents showing the course, not only medically but socially, of the first wave of the AIDS epidemic. We have a performing arts collection with thousands of videotapes and films, and it just goes on and on. We have 30,000 books, 100,000 photographs, over 5,000 different titles of publications in 20 different languages. We have paintings and artwork and artifacts of every description. It's like the collective attic, you might say, of the gay and lesbian movement.
Only more organized, I would hope.
Yeah, and we're still unpacking it. I mean, the other day we were unpacking a box, and I was standing there, and out tumbled a letter written by Oscar Wilde in 1988. Wow. And we have that here on display.
Well, it's very exciting to have this in Los Angeles, of course, but to be available really for so many visitors.
Yes.
Patricia, let me ask you, I know that there's been an interest or an association with history your whole life, and certainly much of it reflected in your writings, but tell me a little bit about your story and your growing up.
Sheila, I grew up in a family that was just really very passionate about history for already many generations. The European side, the oral traditions of the musicians in the family and composers, the Irish who fought British rule. There was a lot about freedom fighters in the family. And on the Native American side, also keepers of histories. The ranch where I grew up in Montana was one of the oldest ranches in the Pacific Northwest, and had real history and life of its own. And it was a place where somehow miraculously, when ranches modernize, usually the old buildings get torn down and a lot of the old stuff disappears, and that didn't happen at our place. And because of this love of history and this concern for the preciousness and the survival of artifacts, and little by little there was this collection that grew up there at the ranch in the old buildings, and to the point where it came to the attention of the National Park Service in the early 1970s, and they recognized it as a sort of time capsule to be able to go there and see what the cattle business and cowboys and that whole era of that is looms so large in the American imagination, what it was really like. The saddles, the buggies, the buildings, all of the stuff is all original to the place, and so it's now a National Historic Site.
Wow.
So out of my own personal experience, I really got to understand the importance. It's not an academic or abstract thing. When you touch those things, when you touch the old saddles that somebody rode in the 1870s or 80s, you are in touch with those people's lives and how things were done and how people felt. And you get a measure about the changes that have happened and the continuity of history and the continuity of human consciousness. And this is a really important thing to sink into a kid's mind. So then it also became important for me as a writer then to start talking about these things in my books.
And what does this place mean to you? I mean, I know that you are getting involved with the One Institute. Certainly you've been involved with an interest in collecting our history and presenting our history. But what does this Institute really represent to you?
Well, instead of the saddles and the buggies and the barns, you know, what we have here are the books, the posters, the art, the artifacts that are those things that that give us that living contact with people that have gone before us, who created everything that we have, and bring those people alive for us. We touch their lives, we touch their beings. It makes it to be not an academic thing, but a real living thing, so that people can come here No different than the tourists who now go to my family ranch and they get a picture that's very different from what you see on television as far as ranching. People can come here, instead of getting the television picture, they get the real feeling of what it was really like to be gay and to be in the closet in the 1940s and 50s, a time when you couldn't associate openly with other gay people. You couldn't send things through the mail. You couldn't dance with other people socially. There were all of these things that we're able to do today that were against the law then. And this is a place where that all comes alive, and so we get that perspective and that measure and that livingness of history, where we came from and where we are now.
Well, who do you think will use this place? Or what is your hope about who might use this?
My hope is that many different kinds of people will come here. Certainly, I hope, gay people of all ages. It was wonderful at the opening the other day to see such a range of ages. I certainly hope that there will be tremendous ethnic diversity of people that will come here, that there will be things in the collection that celebrate the lives and the beingness of African Americans, Latino people, Native Americans, Asians, as well as whites, all the different ethnicities and nationalities that are out there, different religions, people who are not religious, young people, old people, and also, because I've seen it happen so often with books, parents of gay people who have questions. So often they will go to a bookstore and buy a book. Well, they can also come here. Young people who have questions about where it all came from. And especially because our young people really need a lot of information. Kids today generally don't get a very good education on American history generally in school. I was talking to a young man just last night, 20 years old, who was really hazy about what the Cold War was, and I mentioned the John Birch Society, and he said, what was that, So I explained. So for our young people to give them the measure of where it all comes from, it's going to be very important for them. It may seem like a sort of an obvious question, but I'm interested in your notion in the larger sense about why it's important to have a sense of history. I mean, we talk about young people knowing where they came from, but in a way, I just turned 60, and I think we're both in the same decade in our lives. But it's important for us too. We never had that really in our background. And I feel like I still want to capture so much of it. It's part role model, part wanting to have a cultural history, just as an aspect of this important piece of my culture. What do you think in the larger sense? Why do we need to know this stuff or be in touch with it? Sheila, I think that's a great question. I think it comes down to how important it is, no matter what our age is, to have a sense of perspective about who we are. And certainly just from our own personal experiences, we get a certain amount of perspective, especially as we get older. But also we can get perspective from our families and from those larger sources of information that you're talking about. And when I think about my family and all the different people and things that there were out there, the dog soldiers and the healers and the tribal chiefs that were on the native side of my family, the creative people, the Quakers, all the different religions there were on the European side of the family, and all those stories, that's all part of who I am. And it makes me richer to know more about my family and where they came from. That's all a part of me in a really mysterious kind of way. Not just my DNA, but it all kind of comes to rest through the generations of families and how children are taught and dealt with and educated. And if you think of the gay world as a family, and we're not a perfect family and we have our fallings out, but that familyness of who we are, that is basically what is happening here. And so we really need that perspective in order to understand and appreciate ourselves. And if you don't know where you've come from, it's hard to be clear about where you want to go.
It's really true. Well, Michael, I know we were talking about the oral tradition, and I was thinking about your performances, because you collect stories, people, and then you give them back to us through performance. It's certainly not the only way in which you've been an artist, but it really reminded me in its individual way of sort of the idea here. Tell me a little about your background.
Well, you know, I grew up bereft of any sense of history, and as a teenager in the 60s, one would desperately try to find oneself anywhere. You know, in a library, you'd be lucky if you could find yourself reflected in 1 or 2 books, in a magazine article, on the television, in the movies. Where am I? Who am I? What am I? And that's what this is. This is sacred territory, something that you and I didn't have the luxury of being able to connect and say, this is a part of me. These artists, these playwrights, these painters, I can be this. I never had anybody saying to me as a young kid who wanted to be an actor or wanted to be a writer, had all these aspirations. I never had anybody saying, well, here's a list of writers, here's a list of actors, here are their books, here are their movies, here are their costumes they wore. So it's just so rich, you know, and stories. I agree with you. I mean, it's all about stories. Every button that's here, every poster, every photograph, every page of every article, it's a story. There are zillions of stories here. We grew up with a few stories, maybe if we were lucky. And as Patricia said, we need these stories. This is our family tree in some respect. And when you look at the young people who are growing up, and even not so young people who don't have families, who've been discarded by their families, ignored by their families, even more so, they need to connect. And these are the men and women that they can connect to, are surrounding us.
What else do you think is to be found here that's important for us to remember and know about?
Well, I think that just to be able to come to a place, I think that, you know, it's static as it is now. And I think that one of the things that I know we're going to endeavor to do is to enliven it and to give it a living, breathing personality, so that we encourage people to come here and talk, come here and network, come here and read, develop programs that are very friendly, so that people can come and have a discussion about politics in the 60s, or politics through the years, or AIDS art, or a number of things. The women's movement, how it's affected the lesbian movement, and vice versa. I mean, I think there's just a wealth of material here to complement thousands and thousands of programs and discussions, and to bring people in here, to make it attractive, and to make it attractive to people of all ages, of all colors, of all persuasions. You know, of course we want heterosexuals to come here. We want them to learn about us, and especially if they don't know who we are, this is a perfect opportunity.
Now, Mark was talking about one area of the Institute being devoted to materials having to do with the AIDS Holocaust. And of course that's been an issue, not the only one, but one in which, as a person living with AIDS, you've certainly personally exhibited, but also in the characters that you choose and the people that you perform about. Can you tell us a little about that collection?
Well, one of the things that I really want to say is, I remember in the early 80s specific instances where there was a painter or a photographer or a poet whose parents came in, quick, especially when these deaths were quick. Parents came in and obliterated everything. There's nothing left. Their art is gone. There is their poetry is evaporated. Their paintings have been burned. Their words are lost forever. That won't happen now. People will have the foresight to make sure that these works of art are preserved. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it, which is so emotional to me and so moving, is that so many of my dead brethren are alive in this room. I mean, and will not die as a result of being on these bookshelves, in the photo collections. They will be immortal in this space. And we know also that a lot of gay and lesbian people, the point was made eloquently by Karen Oakham, and I'm not going to steal it from her, but that a lot of gays and lesbians don't have children. They don't have a trusting, loving family to leave their things to. this is the place for it to go. They don't want to die not knowing where some of their treasures are going to go, some of their paintings, whether they're artists or not, some of the things that they've collected that are pertinent to our lives and our lifestyles.
You know, it's interesting to me, the three of you being involved in the One Institute, all artists, authors, you know, creators, actually. And this is a place really about creation and sharing. But you also all said activists. I mean, independently of each other, activists. What does it mean to be an activist in this sense, Michael?
Well, I think one of the things an activist does is preserves and sets the record straight. We've seen what has happened around the Holocaust. We've seen people trying to rewrite history. We have been swept away. We have been ignored. We have been obliterated. One of the catchphrases from the AIDS warriors that I love the most is silence equals death. That's an activist slogan, and that's also what this place stands for. We are not silent. These walls are alive. These bookshelves are alive. These paintings are alive. We cannot rewrite our history as long as it is preserved. No one can rewrite our history. And I think that that's another, just a crucial element of what One Institute is about.
Well, tell me what you think also, the Patricia, Mark, because it's interesting. I mean, we have the books. Some are fiction, some are nonfiction. We have historical documents, but we have, you're talking about the buttons, the posters. Although those are acts of creation, to make a button and make a poster, that's not just what they're about. And it's interesting to me to bring this notion together. Sometimes a library is a sort of an unthinking collection of alphabetical materials. But a specialized place. This is more than a library.
That's correct. It is a repository of memories, dreams, and aspirations. It is our lives. And I know the activist part of me has always been about first being an agent for social change and moving the story along to whatever the next chapter needs to be. And then the other part is the remembering part, so that our lives will never be erased. Like the stories I heard from Francois and Ralph.
Well, you're right. I mean, you are
Yes.
an historian.
Yes, I am.
Something leads you to want to do that.
Well, in a way, it's by telling the stories of others, I'm learning about my own story. It's an aspect of my own inner growth and healing from homophobia and all the sins of omission that I think, and sometimes commission, that gay and lesbian people, or any minority group, has to endure. I also had another thought while Michael was speaking, that this, of course, it's a special place, as you were saying, a sacred ground for our people, but it's really for all people. I mean, I think there's a history, the history of homosexuality. By the way, Christopher Isherwood once told me that he hated that word. He much preferred the word gay. And I said, Christopher, why? And he said, oh, homosexuality is such a mouthful. but anyway, the history of what we call homosexuality, which has been constructed in different ways in different cultures and times and places, tells us a lot about the history of heterosexuality. How were these categories invented? What do they mean for all people? So through this particular prism or lens, I think many different kinds of people can gain illumination as to what it just means to be human on the planet.
Well, I think in your work, Patricia, too, fiction, there's a lot of history as well. I mean, I think that you have always sort of seen and presented it and woven it as a background for us. Do you think it's I don't really know how much of the collection is gay and lesbian writers or about gay and lesbian people or topics. Tell me a little bit about sort of what's here and what you think should be here.
Well, I think it's interesting that the word story keeps coming up. Because I've thought a lot about why humans have stories. I mean, there have been stories for millions of years, and ever since we first sat around a campfire somewhere and tried to share our experiences. And what humans have learned from this is that statistics or data or raw information somehow don't inspire people to remember things. But when you put them in form of a story with a beginning and a middle and an end, and something that draws people in and really awakens their emotions and their mind and their spirit and gets their blood racing, people remember stories. And so everything that's here that can somehow be in a story, either it's already in a story in the form of a book, or maybe it is data and stuff in the files that the staff of the One Institute can pull together and put together a presentation or a program that will make that material into a story, then it's ready to be remembered, because it has that capacity to really engage people in a living way. So to me, it's all about stories, whether it's in my books or whether it's about how this is all going to be done here. Stories are the key to everything.
And Patricia, I just wanted to say, speaking of stories, I remember the incredible impact the story that you told in The Front Runner made on my life. I know we were just like students, and it was one of the very first, but we ran out and we didn't go to bed that night. We were just turning the pages. I'm not making this up.
I'm not either.
And it really made a difference. The story that you told made a huge difference in our lives at that time.
And thank you. And there were the stories that had that effect on me. T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which I read when I was 13 as part of a high school history assignment to read about World War I, which was not very real for me as a 13-year-old. It was this war I'd heard about. And something about the upfront and personal nature of this war memoir and the story of these 2 young Arab boys that was threaded through the whole thing, a love story of these 2 kids who had been an item all their lives, and they're in the middle of this terrible war. And that story was the first time that I really realized that there were other people out there who, because I had already had my first thing, I didn't know there was a gay thing or a lesbian thing, but I had my thing with my girlfriend that I loved, you know. And I thought it was like this secret personal thing, and that story pulled it out of me to realize that there were other people like me. And so that story had the same effect on me. And I think as we look back through the generations, there is this wonderful linking together of the stories through the generations that have this effect on people.
You know, Sheila, one thing I wanted to tell you about some of the things that are here, you know, some of it's very fun and almost deceptively fun. For instance, there's an exhibit here now on Charles Pierce, the impersonator. And, you know, these dresses, you know, they're some outrageous, glamoury, glittery, bangly, beaded dresses. But if the truth be known, those dresses were hard won. This was one of the most politically motivated careers in existence, because in the 60s when he was performing, they couldn't wear dresses, and the cops came down and arrested them and took them in for performing in drag. So that dress, while beautiful and fluffy and may seeming to be a frothy sort of thing, is deeply political. And that's what I just think is so great about this, you know, that we have, not only do we have these stories, but we have costumes, and, you know, there's some outrageous pink leather costume up there, and some military clothes, not costumes. Those aren't costumes, Michael.
They are sort of, Michael.
And clergy robes.
For me, they'd be costumes. And the clergy things are gorgeous.
See, that's a great point. I mean, when you're putting like so much about the controversy of gay people in the military is like in the news today, and when you have the dress blues of a Marine Corps officer and the power that really being able to, it's one thing to see it in a photograph or on television,
soulful.
but when it's the real thing, the sword, the cap, you know, it really brings the reality of our women and men that have had this excruciating challenge of being gay in the military. It really brings it home. And so it doesn't matter, and clothing especially, because clothing is so personal. Right. Any kind of clothing.
Well, I remember when our mutual friend Tori Osborne had a birthday party, and it was to celebrate her radical past or whatever, and each of us was to wear some t-shirt that we had worn in the Revolution, such as it was, or in the movement, or whatever. And it was sort of amazing because these were articles of clothing, and they were, each of us was, were ours, and we brought them and we put them up like posters on the wall, and it was like the story of both our personal involvement and pieces of the movement,
right.
The movement. And it's interesting, Mark, when you were talking about the beginning of your involvement at a time in history when we had a movement that we could, fledgling as it was, that we could join. There's sort of that bright line in a way of the unknown past, which was so hidden, which I think is such an important part of what we have here and what we need to know, the stories, of the women leaving their house, sometimes married women, in their regular straight drag, with their clothes in the trunk of the car, going to the market or whatever, and quick changing into something, going to dance for an hour, changing out of it and coming back, and it was an entirely separate life, not known to people.
It's inconceivable. I retired from active journalism in 1994 because I too, like Michael, am HIV positive, and that was kind of a low point, and I just had to stop the presses, or I probably would have not been here. And I'm doing much better now because of all of the new medications. So I went back to school and got a master's degree in clinical psychology, and now I'm working as a therapist with young gay and lesbian youth. And one of the reasons I want to do this is so I have a place to bring them and say, this is you, or a part of you, or a very important part of you. This is your heritage. This is your part of your story, too.
Well, it's going to be an even more important part because the Department of Education in California has just issued guidelines about how it is you comply with this new law that says that you can't discriminate or harass students on the base, or teachers on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity in any of California's schools. And one of the guidelines has to do with materials that libraries should make available. It's not a mandate as to what they have to be, but somehow, as an indicator in the guidelines, that they say would be wonderful, should your school library should have some of this. And I can see this as a very important resource.
Well, let me leave my therapist cap on here in just a minute. That's just one of the three hyphenates, I guess. Is that you would imagine after 50 or some years of an organized gay and lesbian movement in the United States that homophobia would be curbed or more contained, and these wounds that are inflicted on us as a people would be lessened. But I know through my work with these kids that they continue to suffer the devastation of homophobic slurs and physical and mental abuse. I read a report recently, I think it's 88% of all gay kids in America have reported some form of abuse, and that it has largely goes undealt with by school administrators or other adults. And there's not one gay youth that I have counseled that has not reported back to me utter horrible stories. I mean, just when I think I've heard the worst story that you could imagine, I hear something else that's even greater. So this is still going on, and of course this affects the capacity to love, to be loved, and how we function. So what I guess I'm leading up to, this is a healing place. This is a place for people to come and have their hearts mended a bit and their souls healed, just through the power of the objects.
Of course, we're not the first community to want to do this.
No, of course not.
And I know, since I sit on the budget subcommittee that has something to do with funding all the museums in the state, that many of our sort of specialized collections, which probably opened with the same kind of hopes that we have about how everyone would be visiting, really are not doing as well as they thought they would do. And of course, it's our hope and prayer that that won't be the case here. And there's more than 100 collections, at least around the country, none of them this large. But tell me what your hopes would be, both about how this place would be used, but how we also would make certain that it's used. I know that, I mean, anybody, of course, but Michael was talking about programming, which I think is an important part of outreach.
Absolutely. I think that we really need to endeavor. I don't think it's a secret that this organization has been predominantly white and male. And there's nothing wrong with saying that. Those were the men who originated it. And it was their lifeblood and fierceness that allowed this to happen. But we're in a different time now. And we have to make a concerted effort to reach out. And how we're going to do that, I think, is yet to be determined. But believe me, it is being very carefully considered. I mean, we need to make it friendly and sexy, and we need to get youth in here, and we need to attract women and all ethnicities, as Patricia pointed out. And I think that to me, that's one of my really serious goals about this place, is to open it up. And I mean, the material is here. God knows the material spans all ethnicities and as well as women, obviously. And so we just need to bring those people in here. And I think programming is one of the keys. I mean, how we're going to create programs that are friendly and attractive.
So I'm just sitting here thinking about the preservation aspect. I need $80,000 to $100,000 to put in air conditioning and air temperature in the building. We have incredibly rare and fragile items here, and while the University of Southern California has been more than generous, this is their building, we're slightly off campus, we own the collection, so it's our responsibility to preserve it. So my mind is just thinking, oh my heavens, we have these treasures. You know what I mean.
I know very well what you mean. I mean, fundraising is us.
Is us, yeah.
I mean, it's like all this raw material. Now, what are we going to do with it? But we opened, you know, hundreds and hundreds of people were here, ecstatic, crying, carrying on. I mean, so there is a need. You know, there was a real need. It was an amazing, I've been to 1 million events, as you have, and it was one of the most spiritually connected, emotional days I've ever spent. I mean, people were just exuberant and very moved and connected with each other, and it was just an amazing day. So I know in my heart that there is truly a need for this place and what we're doing here.
Well, one of the things that struck me as you were all each speaking is this notion of stories, Patricia, that really we've all been talking about. It seems to me, as you've said, there's 1 million stories here.
1 million.
And I could sit and listen, you know, days and days about them. As a matter of fact, I'd really like you to tell me some of the stories that you know are here. One of your favorites, or, you know, what is here that most appeals to you individually? What do you love that's here?
Well, for me personally, when I was finally to the point in 1972, after 16 years of marriage, and I really gave being a heterosexual a great try, and it didn't work. The inoculation did not take. And I had been living and working in New York State in the media, and so I was in and out of New York, and so already on the newsstands there was the Advocate, which was in those days a little newspaper. It was very discreet, but it was already sold on the newsstands. And so I could go to the New York City office of the Reader's Digest and nip out on my lunch hour and get the Advocate into my briefcase. And through the Advocate, I found out that there was an organization in New York called the Mattachine Society. So that when I was finally ready to make that first phone call, and they still had rotary phones, so it was none of this touchstone stuff, right? It was you know, with my heart beating like this. And I did it in the office because it was, we had a trunk line in New York, and I sneaked the call in on the trunk line, and I called the Mattachine Society, and that was for me the first step. So that's my story about those early day publications and organizations, for me to see those early copies of the Advocate, which are now quite, you know, how newsprint gets yellowed, right? And there they are, and the Mattachine as it was in those days, which for so many people was that first phone call, and that was the beginning of my real living contact with the gay world.
Sheila, you know, I just glanced up. The National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights, October 11th, 1987. It just reverberates. There we were that morning. It was about 7 or 8 a.m. at the Quilt. Almost everyone I was with that day is dead. Almost everyone I was with. James Pickett, David Stebbins, Joe Fraser, Robert Chesley, all dead. And that's what that says to me. That on some level, when I can look at that, they're not dead.
Well, and that was the whole point of the Quilt, too.
Absolutely.
I mean, not only, and it was interesting to me, the notion of the Quilt, it's very much like the notion of this place, which is, it's, first you make something, which is a remembrance. And that, I think, is the artistry, the authors, the activists who, you know, made these, or the artists who drew, or the films, or whatever. Then there is the knitting together of it. I mean, that was the notion of the quilt. Each piece is a person. The quilt is more than one person. And it was really to draw our attention to the enormity of the loss.
And the stories again.
But it was also a way to visit them, and they were stories, very much like these stories. I mean, each square would have a favorite thing, or, you know, a symbol of something
Which
that
was
that
like
person...
a 600-page novel.
Yes, exactly.
Just glancing at it.
Exactly. And then the people who would be there looking, who knew them, or who didn't know them, or connected to them. I mean, I think each book is like that. I mean, reading your books, Patricia, is like that, because fiction is very powerful in that it not only, it doesn't tell you what happened, really, but it tells you what happened really by telling a story that, you know, that brings so much together in one person.
Absolutely, because for me, as a fiction writer, all of that comes out of real life and real people, experiences that I had, stories that other people shared with me, and over the years there is this one institute in my brain of all these things that have been filed away that were all real things and real stories of real people. And at a certain point I reach into my own archives and I take out this and take out that, and my new book, The Wild Man, is very much things that are out of my archive of the 60s, of another country that I lived in, Spain, where they had a fascist government.
Right.
So that it was even tougher to be gay in Spain than it was here in the United States because of the way the country and the government was. And so all of that gets pulled together, and people respond to these things in books because they are real. And I think probably most writers, if not all, work this way in some way. It all comes out of real stuff somewhere.
That you mentioned Franco's Spain, and that was actually my first article I wrote for The Advocate. I was graduating, and David Goodstein said, "Now, all right, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to Europe, of course, after graduation." He said, "Well, will you go to Spain, Franco, Spain?" And I said, "Sure." And he handed me this very slender envelope that just had a few letters. And after Stonewall, I mean, that was sort of the shot heard around the world, and it inspired gay people throughout Europe and other places of the world to form groups. Well, in Spain, of course, Barcelona being the freedom-loving city there was a group, but it was smashed, and many of the members were imprisoned, they lost everything, or exiled out of the country. So he asked me to go and see what I could find. So I had to go to Amsterdam and wait. It was like something out of a spy novel, and finally a voice called like at midnight and said, "Come, now you meet me at a park bench on the Rampas at a certain time and a certain day." And I said, "Okay." So I just packed my bags and I got on a train, and it was summer, so the train was full, and I had to, for 2 days, sleep on the floorboards. Finally got to Barcelona, found the park bench, and waited, and finally this man came, and we just, like gay people do, just a nod. And he went and he introduced me to the last remaining 6 members. Those were all that had been left. They were all in hiding.
Wow.
And that's when I became an activist, when I heard what had happened in terms of the oppression there. You had asked earlier about what our favorite things are, and my favorite thing, I think, would be the first copies of The Ladder, which was the first magazine for lesbians that a woman, dear woman, who was here as our honored guest on Sunday, typed out on a manual typewriter with 3 carbons. She worked as a secretary for one of the big studios, and during her lunch hour, when no one was looking, she would type out the first magazine for lesbians and then mail them out. You know,
Lisa Ben.
Lisa Ben, and we have all of those issues here. So that's one of my favorite objects, are Lisa Ben's magazines.
Well, of course, they say that people who don't know history are doomed to repeat it.
Yes, are doomed.
And I think that it's interesting because ours has been a history of oppression and joy, like so many communities that become a movement to tell their own stories. And I'm struck by the fact that one of the first acts of activism of any community is to tell stories.
Yes.
Because I remember with the women's movement, the power of finding one other person who had the same experience you did. And the only way you can do that is you tell the story, they tell their story, the threads are similar, and you found someone that you assume understands. Out of that group of stories then comes sometimes a sense of sadness at what's gone on, and then perhaps a sense of outrage, and then some hope that as a group, you know, you're kind of a community on wheels. That's what I think a movement is. It's a community that's headed somewhere to redress or to fix or to, you know, activize your way into some better world. And I assume this is sort of the point, in a way, of the gathering of the collection.
Yes, well, it is a joyful place. There is joy here. That's very important. I'm also my roots in the community go into the gay men's spirituality movement, and so that always reminds me that joy first, you know, and the other things can follow. Well,
Now, in addition to air conditioning,
yes.
what else do you envision in the future for the place?
Well, we need paid staff. See, the story of this place is that it is the result of the efforts of literally hundreds of volunteers over 5 decades building this and coming to this culmination. It's all been, we're all have volunteered. And so we're at a point now where obviously we need professional curators and librarians and, you know, an executive director, and, you know, we want to pay living wage, you know, people have to be paid.
What are your hopes for this place, Patricia?
Certainly wonderful events, because as an activist, author, publisher, one of the things that I look for is the way of actualizing things out of concepts and into real life, and so that you get people interacting, and because to tell a story you have to have other people there, and you have to have them, and so that's where you come into the events, the programs. So this is something that I have been talking about a lot with Mark and with Michael also, and the other people here, is what kind of events could be created around gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgendered books and publishing, for example, because books have been a real important vector throughout our history in ways for ideas and feelings to be carried along. Because as a writer, it's very clear to me that after I jump off for the great round, my books will still be there, hopefully, on the shelf somewhere. So books are really important. So what do we do for books? What do we do for the artists? What do we do for the young people? So event planning is a real important part of it. And as we said earlier, to make the events really exciting and colorful so that people will want to be here, and so that they will take something away with them that is useful and meaningful and healing for them.
And Michael, what would be your hopes?
Well, exactly what they said, but I really perceive it as an art space. You know, I mean, I think that this is a place for artists, and especially young queer artists, a place for them to nurture their soul and to connect with that which has gone before them. And I think that, you know, as I said earlier, if I had had something like that as a teenager or as a young adult, wow. We find it on our own, but it's right here.
It's fabulous. Well, thank you all so much.
you.
We've come to the end suddenly of an hour. I always go so fast for me because this is a totally selfish endeavor. I just say, who are 3 people I would like to be able to talk to for an hour, and then make up a reason to do it. And certainly you're 3 of my favorites, and I thank you so much for doing it. And I thank you for being with us. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I hope that you will find a reason wherever you live to visit your local collection, archive, scholarly center, library having to do with gay and lesbian, bisexual and transgender issues, and because actually this is our history and we better get used to it.